So I guess that's me. So welcome everyone, whether you're attending virtually or at the Francis Marion Hotel in Charleston in the Gold Ballroom. Our session title, as you can see on the slide here, is "What is our role in decolonizing and reconstructing curricula? Insights from librarians, faculty, and vendors in Canada and in the US." Do you want to go to the next slide, please? So Tanshi Kiwao, Ashley Edwards Dishnakarshan, in Michif, Dutch, P Scottish, Nia. So hello and welcome everyone. My name is Ashley Edwards and I am Métis, Dutch and Scottish. And to get us started off this morning in a good way, I wanted to share with you a land acknowledgement. We're all coming to you from different places across what is commonly known as Turtle Island. This name comes from Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee creation stories. As you can see from the picture on our slide, North America, maybe we started early. North America is home to many diverse nations since time immemorial. And so I encourage all of you to visit nativeland.ca to see whose land that you are currently located on. So rather than provide you with a list of whose lands we're all on, I wanted to do something different this morning and offer a land acknowledgement for a virtual space. As we gather today virtually, I want to acknowledge that we are meeting using technology available to us by way of colonial institutions, and this is both libraries and academic institutions. And I think this is important to keep in mind, particularly during the past year and a half, and these institutions pivoted to remote access and who may have been left out during this pivot. In Canada, rural and remote communities often do not have the same access to technology as urban locations. So how has this impacted our students and patrons in those communities? In terms of decolonization and indigenization, how have our Indigenous students been left out due to a lack of infrastructure or affordable internet on reserves in cities, but particularly in northern communities? There is this idea that online means accessible, but that isn't always the case. So with my work as the Indigenous Initiatives Librarian, as well as being Métis, I am aware of the intergenerational trauma and access, or the lack of access and distress that Indigenous communities may have towards educational institutions and their employees. And so I always think about, what does this mean for us working towards indigenization of our practices within academia? With library collections, the focus of today's conference, I want to pose the question to you: how are our collections honoring Indigenous ways of knowing, oral traditions, and acknowledging that much of what has been published regarding Indigenous peoples has been extracted from community without permission and without proper attribution? So Kichi Marci, I raise my hands to you in tradition of the nations that I am currently living on, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Ashley, for that beautiful land acknowledgement. So we'll do some formal introductions of our presenter team just shortly, but just a quick run through of our agenda. We're going to start with Ashley and Sheri from Simon Fraser University, talking about helping faculty decolonize their practices and pedagogy. Then we'll turn it over to Rebecca Barton from Harvard, who will be talking around centering BIPOC users in anti-racism efforts. And then lastly, I'll close with some vendor insights from Sage Publishing and TELUS Aspire, some initiatives there. And then we'll have time for some Q&A, hopefully at the end, but we will. So with that, let's do some presenter introductions. Ashley, do you want to start?
Yeah, sorry, I lost my mute button, or my unmute button. So my name is Ashley Edwards. Thank you for having me here with you today. So I use she, her pronouns, and as I mentioned, I'm Métis, Dutch, and Scottish. And this is important in the context of my work to share that with you. And so I'm the Indigenous Initiatives and Instruction Librarian at Simon Fraser University, which is based in Burnaby, British Columbia.
And I'm Sheri Fabian. I'm teaching faculty in the School of Criminology and the director of the Institute for the Study of Teaching and Learning in the Disciplines at SFU, Fraser University in BC, Canada. And one of the things that really long title means is that I have the best job in the world because I get to work with faculty who care about teaching all of the time. Thanks. Happy to be here.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Rebecca Martin. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an associate director of scholarly communication and collections at the Gutman Library, which is the library that serves the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So I am based in Boston, born and raised in Boston, and I am a mixed race, Korean American, Asian, and white woman. Also important for you to learn as part of my presentation later today. So thank you for coming.
And yes, thank you. Good morning. I'm Michael Carmichael. I use he, him pronouns. I'm based in Toronto in Canada. I'm the head of visual media at Sage Publishing. Thanks for joining wherever you are in the world or in Charleston. Okay, now we'll start.
All right, if we can go to the next slide. So we're going to talk about starting this journey, and Ashley and I both speak about what happened at SFU and continues to happen at SFU as a journey. And so what happened, just to give you a little bit of context, in British Columbia, well, in Canada and in British Columbia in particular, in 2012, the BC Ministry of Education required courses in Indigenous studies for the K-12 system to include Indigenous work. In 2015, the National Truth and Reconciliation set out 94 calls to action, which we were tasked with working towards this notion of reconciliation. Of course, without reconciliation or without truth, you can't have reconciliation. And so, as some of you may know, in Canada, we're still building a road towards that truth. In 2017, at SFU, our institution, the Aboriginal Reconciliation Council released its calls to actions. And what happened alongside of all of these is faculty began to reach out to the institute that I now direct for teaching and learning development grants as a resource to help them meet those mandates. Next slide, please, Michael. So the mission of the Institute is to inspire, support, and enhance faculty-led inquiry into all aspects of teaching and learning at SFU. And essentially what we do is we provide professional development for faculty. Faculty come to meet with us. They have an interest in something that they're doing in their classroom or something that they're trying that is new, and they want to understand how it's actually affecting teaching and learning in the classroom. And so it gives faculty an opportunity to reflect on their teaching practice, and it's always anchored in the goal of improving student learning. Next slide, please, Michael. So what happened as a result of all of these faculty coming to the Institute to ask for assistance in decolonization, at the time, the director, like me, is a white settler and feeling ill-equipped to do that. I do have some experience around this in that I spent 15 years validating the claims of residential school survivors for the federal government, the very government that created the residential school system. And so I have a little bit of understanding of some of the impacts on Indigenous peoples, but I'm still a white settler. The pilot project that we did, we worked with an Indigenous faculty member, and I'll speak a little bit more about her in a moment. And we worked with those people to try and assist faculty in doing what they were wanting to achieve. And then we did a follow-up study in which we learned that although the faculty fully appreciated the work that they had with the Indigenous faculty member, they felt there was more depth needed. They were really concerned about overusing the mentors who had deep Indigenous knowledge. That was critical to the program, but they really wanted to have more autonomy to speak with them. They were always concerned that they were overburdening this faculty member. We realized very quickly that a common cause was critical to what was going on, and that the ongoing support from mentors was absolutely necessary. And in addressing the faculty concerns about abusing or overusing the mentors, they really made it clear that they wanted them to be recognized for their expertise and to be compensated for the support that they were providing, which is very much in keeping with Indigenous principles of reciprocity. Next slide, please. So the decolonizing teaching goals, what we then did was we developed a seminar series for faculty that would allow them to learn about the history, the policy, and the Indigenous experience related to ongoing colonialism. One of the things that we often think is that residential schools are in the past and that the products of colonialism have ended, and that is simply not true. The ongoing colonialism continues to have an impact on Indigenous peoples. We wanted to take time to unpack the implication of those themes of history, policy, and experience for teaching and learning and how they could be applied in the classroom. And we were encouraging faculty to develop a critical lens that they could apply to their courses, the discipline, and the world around them. Next slide. So in putting together this seminar series, we created a position known as the Episcopa Fellow. Episcopa was a colleague of Dr. Dolores Vanderway, who was our initial Episcopa Fellow. And she passed away a number of years ago, but she was a mentor to Dolores. And so Dolores reached out to her husband and asked permission to use her name to recognize her as the fellow. The rationale behind this was that we needed someone who had a deep knowledge of colonial history and its impact on Indigenous people. We needed someone who had the capacity to facilitate really challenging conversations around amongst faculty and an ability to model an anti-colonial pedagogy. Her role was as the lead designer and facilitator of our series, and she provides support to ongoing projects. She actually retired about a year and a half ago, but continues to work with some of the faculty or continue on their projects. And I should note that she has expertise in Aboriginal literature and critical Indigenous pedagogy, and she was a member of the Haida Nation. Next slide, please. Sorry. So the structure, we centered Indigenous voices in almost every source that we used. We used one source that was written by a settler, and that was because John Malloy wrote A National Crime, which is one of the first books that really came out and spoke to all of the policies and really looked at unpacking the government behind the residential school movement. We started out with the expectation that we'd have 6 3-hour meetings over the course of 4 months. We sought feedback from the fellow seminar participants and the facilitators on their design throughout. And at the end of this, faculty members were permitted $6,000 to support their design and evaluation of a teaching and learning inquiry project. One of the things we've learned at the Institute is it's one thing to give faculty the tools that they need, but in order to really put them to work, if we give them a small inquiry project, they really put them to work in a different, much more meaningful way. And of course, we had ongoing administrative support, curricular support, and research support from the ISLTD team and the Episcopa Fellow. Next slide. So the focus of this seminar series was to anchor in the notion of the story. Story is essential to Indigenous pedagogy, to Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and we made that a center in what we were doing. That led to a seminar that was informed by reader response theory and with emphasis on insight into the Indigenous experience. At the same time, we were emphasizing settler responsibility. Faculty were engaging in critical and sometimes unsettling reading and dialogue about Canada's colonial past and present. We encouraged them to reflect on links to teaching and learning and to reflect on the institutional structures and practices that are in place that create all kinds of obstacles to the work that we were trying to do. Next slide. So in our first iteration, we had over 20 applicants. We accepted 8 new and experienced tenure track and teaching faculty. So they were very disparate. 5 of the participants came from arts and social sciences and 3 were from the sciences. All of them had some experience in critical perspectives, and everyone had a strong commitment to pushing against colonial practices within the academy. At the end of our 6th session, they begged us for a part 2. And so these same 8 participants, we then went into a subsequent series where we added 8 additional 3-hour seminars, and that lasted almost another 8 months. Next slide, please. So we then went on to open up a second iteration. Originally, we were supposed to do 3 iterations of 8, and what we ended up doing was condensing the second iteration. And we changed from the 6 to the 14, and then we did the same for the second iteration. So we only ended up doing 2 iterations of our planned 3 seminar series. So in this case, again, we had more than 20 applications. We accepted 9. Up front, these faculty members knew coming in that it would be 14 3-hour seminars over 10 months. Thankfully, by the time we had to pivot to remote, we had built a community and that we were able to complete remotely. We think it would have been incredibly challenging to have tried to achieve this in only a remote setting, although it's possible we may have been okay, but we're grateful we didn't have to experience that. What did happen as a result of COVID is that not all of the faculty members ended up doing an inquiry study, but we're now getting the reports in from some of those who have done that. And the work that they have done it's really fulfilling and heartwarming to see the depth of learning that has occurred within their students. Next slide, please, Michael. And so I really feel this is the beginning of the journey in telling this story, and it is to be continued. And I leave this, my part of this presentation with this quote about, from one of our participants. I feel like the journey of taking up the work of decolonizing our teaching and our institution and our work is just beginning. I think being part of some kind of community of practice with ongoing mentorship would really help support everyone in their ongoing journey. We're now in the process of evaluating these iterations and determining the impact and helping to redesign what decolonizing or disrupting colonialism through teaching might look like in future. Thank you, and over to you, Ashley.
Awesome. Thank you, Sheri. I am just, should have done this earlier, popping something in chat. It's applicable to my talk. So thank you, Sheri. And as Sheri mentioned, SFU released their report, Walk This Path With Us in 2017. And this is a direct response to the TRC calls to action. And within that report, there were 34 calls specific to SFU. So sorry, the ARC report had 34 calls specific to SFU, one of which is to establish an Indigenous Curriculum Resource Center. So I've popped the link to that in the chat, as well as put the full name for folks who are not attending virtually and can't click on the link. So during our consultations, it was discovered, or faculty expressed that they understand the importance and of doing this work, and they're interested in it, but they're often unsure how. And so this sort of parallels the experience that Sheri had with her grant program. And so out of that, it was envisioned that the ICRC would be a place for faculty to come for assistance in learning the how and why to decolonize and indigenize both pedagogy and curriculum. So the collection and resources available will provide not only that starting place, but also information on why this work is important and background on Canada's colonial history, because we can't move forward if we don't understand why if we don't understand the past. So the development of this center began in April 2020, and it was always planned to be a physical and an online presence. COVID, of course, drastically changed some of these plans, and it became more important to focus on the online presence at that point. So until recently, all renovations to the physical space have been on hold. So I don't have any images to share with you of that. It's all kind of corded off, and hopefully next year we'll have things. But rather, I wanted to show you both a screenshot of the ARC report because of how foundational it is to this work, as well as to the homepage of my center, including the Indigenous Initiatives logo created by Marissa Nahani, who is Squamish and Niska, and we use that for all Indigenous initiatives work at the library. So what's important, what I want to talk with you about today is more about the physical space and the collection, because all of the books and physical resources in the collection will not be used, not be using Library of Congress classification, rather will be using a modified Brian Deere classification system. And I just need to recognize that that both the collection and the Brian Deere modification that I've been working on this year is pan-Indigenous. And so it doesn't represent a specific nation or community. And SFU has 3 campuses. We've got Burnaby, Surrey, and Vancouver. And each is located, or sorry, not each, but for a total of being on nine local nations within the lower mainland of British Columbia. So I didn't focus on a specific nation. Additionally, each city is home to urban Indigenous peoples coming from communities and nations across the country we're calling Canada. So I specifically used a pan-Indigenous approach to this work so that all Indigenous people can see themselves in the work. Next slide, please, Michael. So this is a screenshot of one of the pages that I created last year to show you a little bit about what the collection looks like and how it's being presented to faculty. So to assist faculty in their work, the collection includes materials on topics such as Indigenous pedagogy, which you can see here, Indigenous research methods and methodologies, Indigenous understandings of ownership and copyright. And then I have a page as well dedicated to doing respectful research. And that page includes resources such as, or on topics such as Indigenous data sovereignty, citations, and Indigenous information literacy. And so each topic is prefaced with a short description or explanation, such as the one you can see here. And so I reference key people in the area, and just to give a little bit of an introduction so faculty know what Indigenous pedagogy, for example, is. Because if you start saying, oh, please practice Indigenous pedagogy, there's a lot of, well, what is that? How can I do that? So here's a little bit about what it is, as well as in some books to support their learning. And so I've got a virtual bookshelf created for each topic. As well, I have, which you can't see here, but linked also articles, websites, videos, podcasts. And I really wanted to provide faculty with a variety of materials to kind of hit on all different learning styles, recognizing that while this collection and center is aimed for faculty support, we're going to get other librarians, we're going to get research assistants, graduate students, undergraduate students. So really providing something for everyone. There are a few limitations to the collection. We aren't including poetry, fiction, or drama, or really any children's books. Memoirs and biographies are going to be included if there's a focus on Indigenous learning and teaching and knowledge sharing practices, or if the books are about an Indigenous person's experience within educational settings. And this is really because the ICRC's focus is on supporting that decolonizing and indigenizing pedagogy and practices approach. And it is not expected or anticipated to be a collection that contains all materials written by or about Indigenous peoples or topics. Maybe one day, but not today. So I want to take the rest of my time to talk with you. I did not time myself, so I might actually be, anyways, to talk with you a little bit about the Brian Deere classification setting or classification system. Michael, if you could switch slides, please. So I started creating this presentation and realizing that many people might not know about this classification system because it's very locally developed and Canadian. It was developed by Mohawk librarian Brian Deere in the mid-1970s while he was working with the National Indian Brotherhood, which is now known as the Assembly of First Nations. Unsurprisingly, in his work in the library, he found both Library of Congress and the Dewey system problematic and developed a system that centered Indigenous knowledge structures. And this system is based on areas of activity within the NIB, which is a political organization representing in Aboriginal rights title and in Aboriginal rights and title, and it honors relationality. And this is most noticeable in his, by the way that nations and communities are organized rather than alphabetically, they're organized geographically. So neighboring communities are next to each other. Next slide, please. So this system is really designed to be flexible. And what I did in mine, because of its flexibility, you can modify it to suit your collection. And so it was never intended to be the overarching or the universal Indigenous classification system. And so what I did is I collaborated with Eleanor Wellwood at UBC's Waywell Library, and we revamped it. And everything will be on my website because I'm really conscientious I'm taking up too much time. But we've centered Indigenous peoples and communities, and are kind of like spiraling or rippling out from there. So then what makes up an Indigenous community, language, worldview. Worldview includes philosophy, religion, spiritual practices, and then outwards. And so at the very end of the classification system, which I think about as a spiral, but is of course a linear system, we get the more colonial topics. And so things like government and justice is very much near the bottom. And we purposely also made some language changes. So Indigenous peoples' history and culture became Indigenous peoples' communities and culture to further stop historicizing how Indigenous peoples are located within library settings. And I think I'm gonna end there, and I'm happy to talk about the Brian Deere system later. And like I said, all of the materials will be available on the website, but I will turn it over to Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Ashley. And thank you also, Sheri, for sharing about what's going on at your institution. I'm really kind of honored to sit alongside you to talk about some of the efforts that I'm doing locally at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, that focuses more on anti-Black racism and efforts for us as librarians to try to address anti-Black racism in our own approaches to collection development, to scholarly communication. So if you don't mind going to the next slide, Michael, I'm gonna bring up 4 projects today, and I'm not gonna go into depth about all 4, but I really wanted to bring up the projects and tell you a little bit more about the frameworks and the approaches we're using to tackle those projects. And some of the work that I'm doing or that I'll be talking about today is really informed by kind of 3 frameworks in particular. The frameworks and the principles from Femifesto, from the Design for Justice Network, and the Design for Diversity Toolkit. And I just put links to those into the chat if you'd like to explore those. But the frameworks are really ones that I've been using to build intentional relationships with our users, to engage them in our collection development and our scholarly communication practices, kind of under the ethos of, quote, nothing about us without us. Myself as a mixed race, Asian, white woman, for me in particular, it's important for me to practice this in allyship and solidarity with Black colleagues, with Black users, and really trying to address issues of racism, not only on an interpersonal level, but really trying to interrogate our institution, the systems that we use, the discovery systems, the tools that we use to collect material, to really determine how racism shows up in our everyday activities. So if you could go to the next slide, Michael. So I'm going to talk about first 2 projects where users led the project. So it was their idea. They came to the library looking for collaboration, sometimes tools, sometimes expertise. And the first was a project last year where kind of definitely spurred by student action at Dartmouth College, a student group locally at the Harvard Graduate School of Education called Undocu Allies. So students who were undocumented or allies of students who were undocumented came to my library and asked like what we were doing about the, quote, illegal alien subject heading that was still at the time visible and discoverable in our catalog. So we did the work. We figured out the best way to remove that from our catalog, while also trying to continue to address it at the Library of Congress level, at the systemic level. And in the chat, I just put, kind of a key report from the American Library Association that helped us implement that work locally. And that was a really important project for us, that working directly with the students to, hear directly from them the harm that this particular term was having on them, on those students who held undocumented status. And we learned a lot from that process of the best way to listen and engage with our users, and kind of work with them to determine what the best alternative terms would be to replace, quote, illegal aliens with. And then the more recent example that we have that is ongoing right now this year is there is a student organization at the Graduate School of Education called the Solidarity Collective for Black Lives. So it's a multiracial coalition of students and some staff members who put together a reading list that they're calling the Anti-Oppressive BIPOC Critical Scholars List. And BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And so they put together this pretty incredible reading list, really hoping to influence faculty at the school to start incorporating these more in their classes, especially for our doctoral students in their comprehensive exams. And they came to the library after they had already created this list on their own. And I just put a link to the list itself in the chat if you want to look at it, at kind of their statement of why they created it. And when they approached the library, they weren't looking for content help. They weren't necessarily looking for us to help add citations to the reading list. They were looking for a better way to make it discoverable, that they had been using Google Sheets as a way to maintain the list, and they were looking for better tools. So we helped them, determine that Zotero is a citation management tool. It kind of fit the bill for what they were looking for. But in the course of our work together with them, actually migrating the list to Zotero, we were also recognizing that they were creating their own tagging schema. They were developing their own keywords to help describe these resources that they were coming across. And so, we asked them more about like how they came to these keywords, why they were creating them, because our assumption was a lot of this is just included in the subject headings, in the controlled vocabulary that's already in the catalog. And they explained that they had developed a separate additive list because they were seeing, again, deficit focused languages, harmful languages in the catalog that they wanted to create some sort of counter narrative for. So in our learning with them, we are kind of leveraging our expertise in creating a standardized schema, but to incorporate the keywords that they've already developed, and really trying to support their work to make the language that they've identified that will help describe this work, and put that into the catalog rather than defaulting only to our kind of controlled authority records. So I think it's a really nice example of, the quote illegal aliens work, removing things from our catalog is, absolutely reparative work that we're doing, but there's also a real need to identify what are the gaps and kind of the missing representation, as well as kind of another approach to quote fixing descriptions. If you don't mind going to the next slide, Michael. And then for the next two projects, I wanted to just briefly talk about. These are projects that were library initiated. So the quote illegal aliens and then the Solidarity Collective list were projects that were brought to the library that users were trying to engage us in our expertise. And then the two projects I'm about to share are ones where the library initiated engagement with users. And the first is, when we think about collaborative collection development and that phrase, we're often talking about partnerships with other institutions and kind of aligning collection development policies, and potentially with sharing agreements. But at the Gutman Library, where I work, we are trying to engage our BIPOC students in particular in having them inform our collection development policy. And that absolutely requires their time and their own expertise. So we're doing what we can to compensate them for that effort and that contribution to us. But we're really trying, again, here to understand, like, what are the gaps in our collection? So doing essentially a gap analysis and including them to help us understand, like, what are you not getting for your courses? What are you not getting for your own independent research? What are you not seeing even in your student activities? And how can the library support those efforts? And then briefly, because I want to give Michael some time, the prioritizing BIPOC faculty publications for our institutional repository. This was, at first a really exciting project for us to undertake. And our intention was really to celebrate the scholarship of our Black faculty in particular and put that into our institutional repository. And we realized very quickly that before we jump to the celebration and share and trying to amplify their work, we needed to stop and recognize the truth of why we hadn't been celebrating their work as much up until that point. So why was it that the murders of George Floyd, the kind of sudden excitement and activity around anti-racist efforts at an institution, that work needed to happen, the acknowledgement needs to happen, but the truth and the reckoning of why it took so long to come to that point also needs to happen at the same time. So, our intention was to celebrate, but the impact of it really was our Black faculty coming back to us and asking, like, we'll cooperate, but, it's not a mutually beneficial relationship historically. So what are we going to do to kind of repair that relationship? And Michael, I'd love to turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and to you, Sheri and Ashley. I have to say it has been a real privilege being on the same panel with you to learn from you from the various different initiatives being led at your institutions. So I'll just spend a few brief moments just closing our presentation and talk about some vendor perspectives from SAGE and from TELUS. So the first thing to say is that vendors do have a big role to play here too, to assist in the aims of our university faculty and library partners. Many librarians watching and listening will be aware of some context here, illustrating just how vital it is that meaningful change is made as quickly as possible. Libraries have spoken about knowledge organization and continue to do so, but there are different meanings of knowledge, as we've been hearing today. And some knowledge domains that we know of are rightly being contested for their dominance from traditional white power bases too. In 2017, the Research Library Partnership conducted a survey on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, to assess the key domains of interest for librarians. And although 4 years ago, it was interesting to note at the time that archival description was seen as an area already changed. However, 70% or more of respondents indicated that metadata description and terminologies in library catalogues urgently needed changing. And as Rebecca was commenting just beforehand, in terms of action at Harvard, this student-led movement changed their library catalogue subject heading illegal aliens to undocumented immigrants after the Dartmouth student petition, the Library of Congress failed, has been replicated nationally and has become a very profound national movement. And so it's into this environment of change that vendors must work very collaboratively with their university and library partners. Vendor platforms have many layers of metadata that feed into library catalogues. There are many different definitions, overlapping definitions of metadata, but the one on screen published by Lorcan Dempsey of the OCLC is quite a nice, nuanced one for this discussion. In a world where we need to understand the multiple definitions of what we mean by knowledge, as we've been describing in this talk, robust metadata is needed more than ever, and is likely to constantly change and adapt as library catalogues or university curricula change and adapt too. And following this, if our content teams at SAGE and in other vendors' content teams are to prepare more diverse and inclusive content, then the taxonomies on which they sit will need to be reviewed, developed, or potentially reconstructed regularly, because these taxonomies help users reach and understand this content and knowledge. And so what do we mean at Sage by taxonomies? Probably universally understood. These are our subject trees comprising the keywords that allow our users to locate and make sense of content or knowledge on our platforms. And at Sage, we have multiple digital products with varying different hierarchies of subject organizations in place. The example on screen on the right is from Sage Video for our sociology collection, which is an early development iteration, and which takes the curriculum in sociology as its organizing principle. These taxonomies are developed and then redeveloped through a multi-tiered process involving our product innovation teams, PI on this slide, our internal editorial teams, and then guided by editorial boards. Speaking to a previous slide, it's critical at this point that we can best represent knowledge in all its forms. And when we do revisit taxonomies, we must consider this in three terms, or warrants, as our executive user experience manager at Sage, Alan Maloney, has described. Each of these warrants, a content, a user, or a structural warrant, is very important and equally important to be borne in mind to ensure that content or knowledge is appropriately represented in our digital product and then located and found by end users. And so at Sage, we are already making commitments to change, as I'm sure other vendors are too. Speaking as the head of visual media, we are committing to regularly updating our Sage Knowledge video collections, which will include dedicated efforts to ensure that they are decolonized, diverse, and inclusive of multiple knowledge domains at the content, user, and structural level. This is going to mean a critical examination of our subject collections, which span the social and behavioral sciences, ensuring that we have the appropriate social structures in place to guide us. And for more information about this, our web link is on page. And we also have an additional resources page that we'll be happy to supply to the conference after this talk. And what are we doing next? Well, we're very immediately diving into some global market research with our faculty and library advisory boards, kicking off next week, actually, with Canadian and US groups. This is going to start with some focus groups on some fundamental questions in DEI that are pertinent to this talk. For example, how are you approaching decolonization work for your course? What sources are available to you? What are the key challenges and opportunities that you foresee? What are the key considerations for the library and within library workflows? And then beyond that, we're going to take that into a more expansive global survey, and the learnings of which will be hugely important to us, the work that we do. We're also creating better support structures to guide us around content framing and platform user experience. For example, rebuilding our editorial boards on subject collections and considering some new developmental partners from the library community in place to assist on some of our platform development questions. And then lastly, I just want to mention the important work that our telus colleagues are doing in this area. Telus Aspire Resource List Management Solution offers a supportive framework to structure, teach to, and then share these decolonized diverse resources. For example, a project at the University of Kent in the UK, working with students on an initiative to diversify the curriculum at the university was led. They identified the library as the leaders of the project, as owners of the content, as well as Telus Aspire, which is a resource list management system within the library, to help lead that. So within faculty created resource lists, librarians use the Telus Aspire tool to identify who is accessing and reading what content on those reading lists. And then matching this data with the author backgrounds of content being used, they were able to guide faculty identifying areas for improvement to their curricula. Other Telus Aspire users have identified resource lists as a key starting point for decolonization and diversification projects, as you can see in the screenshots. For universities using Telus Aspire, information about which resources are being recommended to students can be found all in one place, making it identify which authors are being used in each cohort. And I think I will stop because I think we're probably at time, if not over time. So thank you very much. And I will stop sharing and open it up to questions. Let's see what we have in the chat. Do we have time for questions? We're a little over time.
I think we're about at time. Yeah, Michael. There were a couple of, maybe one question we can address quickly. Somebody was asking if the slides will be available to share, and I believe so, right?
That's right. We can share our slides and notes, and we've also collectively prepared an additional resources document I think I've cited, and we put that in Google Doc, and I think we'd all be happy to share that with this community too, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, are there any other questions at all?
I'm just checking the chat. There's one, I think, for Rebecca about knowing more about the efforts to center BIPOC inclusion in the IR.
Yeah, so I'll definitely encourage folks. I'm happy to email further with anybody, or have offline conversations too, since we're short on time now. But yeah, so this effort was really to work directly with some of our Black faculty to first encourage them to deposit their faculty publications into our institutional repository. We do have an open access policy at my institution, and so that was kind of the first step, kind of helping gather their publications for inclusion in the repository. And then, the second big part of that conversation is how to highlight their publications, and whether we want to create kind of a special spotlight collection. And that was kind of where the conversation I mentioned earlier about like the truth and the reckoning of like why is it taking this long to kind of do that celebration and to make that recognition happen now. So we are definitely still kind of exploring how best, or if at all, to do that type of special spotlight. And to kind of learn directly from those faculty members what their preference is. That are we do have an open access policy and mandate that we're trying to meet, but we don't want to do that at the expense of the relationships that we're trying to build with the faculty at the same time. But in terms of the specifics of the project, if folks would like to email me directly, I'm happy to talk offline.
Thank you, Rebecca. Well, we want to be very respectful of the next presenter's time in the Gold Ballroom and elsewhere virtually. I'll just say thank you very much from myself. It's been a real pleasure speaking today and joining my fellow panelists. And we will share these resources with you all.